The cereal was the first thing Ranger Bowen noticed. 2 bowls of it sitting on the picnic table, a third overturned on the bench. A carton of milk had gone soft in the midday sun. The camping stove was still connected at the far end of the table, a pot of water on the burner, never heated. The family's Chevy Tahoe sat locked on the gravel pad 40 feet from the tent. Through the windows, Bowen could see a phone charger plugged into the console, a fleece draped over the passenger headrest, wallets in the center compartment. 4 sleeping bags lay inside the tent. Near the fire ring, 4 sets of boot prints led south through the soft ground toward a service road that had been closed since June. But only 1 set of prints came back. For nearly 2 hours, the search team assumed those returning prints belonged to a family member, someone who had come back for a forgotten jacket, a phone, a set of keys. They were wrong. The boots that returned to that campsite didn't belong to anyone in the Maddox family. Welcome to Mind After Dark. The stories you're about to hear are presented as allegedly true accounts shared by rangers, hikers, search volunteers, and park employees. Names, locations, and identifying details have been changed. These are stories about isolated places and the people who exploit them. The threats are human. That's what makes them hard to set down. Story 1. The Empty Family Campsite. I've been a backcountry ranger for 11 years, most of that in a park I won't name directly, though if you've driven through the Southern Cascades in Washington State, you've likely passed the entrance without registering it. The park is small relative to Rainier or Olympic, and most of its backcountry sites are spread across dense second-growth forest, connected by gravel spur roads that narrow as they push deeper into the drainage. In September, after the summer crowds thin out, you can drive those roads for an hour without meeting another vehicle. The silence gets into your instruments after a while. You start hearing your own truck differently. Site 14 sits at the dead end of one of those spurs, a primitive vehicle access campsite in a shallow basin surrounded by Douglas fir. Flat ground, a reliable creek to the east, a steel bear box, a fire ring, 1 picnic table. There's room on the gravel pad for a single vehicle. The road in is about 6 miles of single-lane gravel from the paved route, and the final mile gets rough enough that we lose a culvert every other winter. The Maddox family checked in on a Thursday afternoon. Greg and Laura, both in their early 40s. Their teenagers, Ethan at 16 and Cass at 14. I wasn't at the visitor center that afternoon, but the seasonal volunteer who processed their permit remembered them clearly and told me about it later. Greg had asked a run of specific questions: water sources near Site 14, whether the bear box latch had been replaced after the incident earlier that summer, how far the nearest reliable cell coverage was from the campsite, the kind of questions an experienced camper asks. Laura mentioned that they'd done 2 other national parks that season and wanted a quieter site for the last trip of the year. Cass, who was 14 and by most measures too old for the program, bought a junior ranger patch and pinned it on her pack strap in the parking lot. Ethan asked whether the topographic map they'd brought was current, and the volunteer marked the recent trail closures for him in pencil, including the service road south of the campsite that had been gated since June. They left the visitor center around 3. They drove the spur road in without incident. They set up camp before dark. Their permit ran through Sunday morning. Here's what happened instead. Around 7 on Sunday, while the family was preparing breakfast, a man walked into their campsite from the direction of the closed service road, reflective vest over a dark, long-sleeve shirt, clipboard under one arm, handheld radio clipped to his belt. He wasn't in a uniform, exactly, but he was in the kind of high-visibility work clothing that reads as official at a distance. He introduced himself by first name and said he was with a trail maintenance crew doing storm assessment on the gravel spur road. He used the site number correctly, Site 14, and referenced the culvert history without prompting. He said one of the drainages about 2 miles back toward the paved route had failed overnight and washed a section of the road out. Passenger vehicles couldn't get through. A detour had been established using the old service road, which he said had been temporarily reopened for the evacuation. He unfolded a printed map showing the route, marked in orange highlighter, connecting through the service road to a forest access route on the park's southern boundary. A crew vehicle, he said, would meet the family at the far end. Greg asked reasonable questions. He asked to see identification, and the man produced a laminated card that looked plausible in the morning light. Agency logo, photo, name, credential number. Greg asked whether they could drive the Tahoe. The man said no. The service road wasn't rated for passenger vehicles, too narrow and too rutted, and that anyone attempting it would likely bottom out within the first mile. 2 miles on foot to the meeting point, and the crew would bring them back for the vehicle once the culvert was patched. Laura asked how long the repair would take. The man said a few hours. Engineering had already been out to look at it, and that the family should take water, jackets, whatever they wanted for a short hike. Leave the heavy gear, leave the tent standing. They'd be back before noon. Laura noticed one thing. She asked why the crew hadn't come up the spur road itself to notify campers, rather than approaching from the service road direction. The man said the crew truck was staging at the far end of the service road with the equipment, and that walking up from that side was faster than driving around. He said it easily. The answer was reasonable. It matched the geography. The family made a decision that any careful family would make in the same situation. They put on their hiking boots. Greg took his phone and both IDs. Laura packed water and a small first aid kit into her day pack. Ethan pulled on his boots and checked his sister's laces before they left the tent. Cass slid her phone under her sleeping bag. She'd texted a friend the night before, and the message hadn't sent, and she didn't want to carry a dead brick down the road and back. They followed the man toward the closed service road at about 7:15. Ethan and Cass reached the paved park road at 10:40 Sunday morning. A maintenance employee named Sandra Hoff was checking culverts on that road, all of which were intact and undamaged, when 2 teenagers came out of the tree line about 4 miles east of the Site 14 turnoff. Ethan was holding his sister's hand. Cass's shoes were soaked through, and her forearms were scratched raw from thick understory. Ethan was still calm enough to give Sandra the site number, his parents' names, and the direction they'd come from. He asked Sandra to radio for rangers and told her his mother and father were still with the man on the service road. Sandra called it in. My partner Dave Kelling and I were the closest units. We drove the spur road towards Site 14, and about a mile from the campsite, the road was blocked, not by a culvert failure, but by 2 heavy fir limbs dragged across the gravel and wedged against roadside trees. The cuts on the limbs were clean. Chainsaw work, not old blowdown. Someone had staged the blockage to buy time. We couldn't get the truck through. We moved the limbs enough to squeeze past on foot and walked the last stretch in. The campsite looked like a family had stood up from breakfast and simply left. That's the phrase I've used every time I've had to describe it since. Stood up and left. The cereal in the bowls had gone soft and sweet-smelling. The milk was warm. The stove was still connected to the fuel canister, the pot of water untouched. The tent was staked properly, the rain fly secured, the front zipper pulled about 2/3 open. Inside, 4 sleeping bags lay flat with personal items tucked along the walls, rolled clothing, a toiletry pouch, a paperback splayed open, a headlamp hanging from the ceiling loop. The Tahoe was locked. Through the windows we could see wallets in the center console, sunglasses on the dash, Laura's purse on the floor behind the driver's seat. Dave ran the plate over the radio, and it came back to a residential address in Medford, Oregon. Dave found Cass's phone under one of the sleeping bags when he checked the tent for anything the search team should know about. It was powered off. Near the fire ring, the ground was soft enough to hold clear impressions. 4 sets of prints led south from the campsite toward the closed service road. 2 larger hiking boots, 2 smaller trail shoes. The larger sets were spaced like adult men and women. The smaller sets were spaced like teenagers. All 4 sets moved together at a normal walking pace in the same direction. The man who directed them walked at the edge of the road on compact gravel. His prints were partial and indistinct, visible only in a few spots where gravel gave way to mud along the shoulder, enough to see he'd been there, not enough to read tread or size clearly. Then there was the 5th set, a smooth-soled work boot, wide with a distinct heel stamp. This set came from the south, walked into the campsite after the family had left, and did not walk out the same way. Dave saw it first and pointed. One of them came back. That was our working assumption for almost 2 hours. Someone in the family had returned for a forgotten item. It was the simplest explanation, and the one that let us keep hoping the situation was recoverable. We looked at the prints and told ourselves stories that fit. Greg came back for his wallet, or Ethan came back for his sister's phone, or Laura came back because she'd forgotten something in the tent. We searched the campsite for evidence of what had been retrieved and found nothing missing. The prints didn't move like a person walking to the tent and back either. They moved in a slow circuit. The tent, the bear box, the Tahoe, stopping at the driver's door, then continuing to the far side where the gas cap had been opened, then out of the campsite heading northwest, up the slope, in a direction that didn't lead anywhere on any current map. I crouched beside a clean impression near the bear box and followed the returning track back toward the southern edge of the clearing. There, within a few feet of one another, the ground held all 5 patterns clearly enough to compare. The family's 4 outgoing tracks were distinct. One adult boot had a deep chevron tread. The other had closely spaced rectangular lugs. Ethan's boots left a narrow heel with an angled outer edge, while Cass's trail shoes had a broken diamond pattern through the center. The returning print matched none of them. It was broader than either adult track and nearly smooth through the forefoot, with a flat heel carrying a stamped oval near one corner. It also pressed deeper into the soil than the family's prints, suggesting a heavier person or someone carrying additional weight. I called Dave over and pointed to the 5 patterns without saying anything. He studied them one by one, then traced the returning prints with his eyes as they circled the tent, the bear box, and the Tahoe. "That isn't one of them," he said. "No." The comparison was later confirmed using the shoes Ethan and Cass were still wearing, and the footwear recovered with Greg and Laura. None matched the work boot impressions. Someone else had entered the campsite after the family left. I got on the radio and requested a full search call-out and law enforcement response. Then I followed the unidentified prints northwest, up the slope. About 150 feet uphill, where the basin sloped toward a low ridge, I found a compressed area in the underbrush. Someone had been sitting or kneeling there for a while. A small branch had been snapped at eye level, opening a clear sight line down into the campsite. From that spot, you could see the picnic table, the tent, the Tahoe, and the gravel pad clearly. You could watch someone eat breakfast. You could count them. A cigarette butt was half buried in the dirt near the compressed area, ground out carefully with a heel. None of the Maddoxes smoked. I flagged it and backed away. The search operation started that afternoon. 31 people, 2 dog teams, and a helicopter for the first few hours until cloud cover pushed it down. Ethan and Cass were taken to a hospital in the nearest town for evaluation and interviews. Both were treated for scrapes, mild dehydration, and shock. Both were coherent and cooperative. I was assigned to the team following the closed service road south. The service road had been washed out since June. About a mile past the junction with the spur, a 15-foot section of road had collapsed into the creek drainage, leaving a muddy chute down to the water. No vehicle could pass. Foot traffic was possible if you scrambled, and we did. On the far side, the road climbed for another half-mile before leveling into a wide gravel turnout that had once been used to stage road repair equipment. The turnout held fresh tire tracks. A heavy vehicle had backed in, sat long enough to leave an oil spot on the gravel, and driven out in the direction of the state forestry boundary. The turnout is invisible from any maintained trail. Unless you'd studied the park's decommissioned road maps, you would have no reason to know it existed. We followed a first lead that didn't pan out, a set of drag marks near the turnout that looked significant until we traced them to a downed limb that had been pulled clear of the road. Then Rick Alderman, a retired game warden volunteering with the search, spotted something in a natural alcove where the road curved against a basalt outcrop about a half-mile past the turnout. The alcove was sheltered from above by an overhang and screened from the road by second-growth alder. From more than 50 feet away, you wouldn't see anything worth looking at. From closer, you'd see the corner of a brown tarp weighted with rocks. Under the tarp, 2 replacement trail signs, standard brown posts with white lettering, one reading, "Service Access, Authorized Personnel Only," and the other reading "Trail Closed, Alternate Route," with a directional arrow. Both were built well enough to pass at walking distance. Beside them, in a waterproof plastic bin, we found a high-visibility vest, a clipboard with photocopied campground reservation maps, and a manila envelope containing printed photographs of vehicles in various parking areas. There was also a folded topographic map with 5 backcountry sites circled in pencil. Site 14 was one of them. Beside each circled site was a date. Beside Site 14 was the Thursday date the Maddox family had arrived. Rick took off his cap, put it back on, and said quietly, "He's been running this for a while." We didn't touch anything beyond what we needed to identify. Rick radioed the location, and we waited for the law enforcement team. Greg and Laura Maddox were found alive on the 4th day of the search. They had been restrained at a location on state forestry land approximately 11 miles from the campsite. 2 men had held them, moving them once during the 4 days, apparently attempting to coerce financial information, bank accounts, PIN numbers, the location of valuables at their home in Medford. Greg had lacerations from zip tie restraints and was hypothermic. Laura had a fractured wrist from the initial altercation on the service road. Both were dehydrated, exhausted, and conscious. The man Ethan and Cass had seen at the campsite was arrested during the search. The second man was apprehended 4 months later in another state, in possession of materials similar to those found in the alcove staging area. Investigators concluded that the two men had been targeting isolated, well-equipped campers at primitive vehicle access sites, using the fake maintenance worker approach to separate families from their belongings and move them into locations where they could be pressured for financial information and vehicle access. The 5 circled sites on the topographic map were all remote drive-in sites at multiple parks in the region. Whether every circle represented an actual attempt or a plan that was never executed, investigators couldn't say for certain. The evidence supported that the two had operated for at least the previous year and had likely done this successfully before. The work boot prints, the smooth soles that walked back into the campsite while the family was gone, did not conclusively match either man's footwear. Both suspects owned multiple pairs of boots. The stride and heel stamp were closer to one of the two than the other, but the match was inconclusive. The gas cap on the Tahoe had been opened, and no one ever explained why. It's possible the man was checking whether the vehicle could be drained or driven off later. It's possible one of the two had a third pair of boots that was never recovered. It's possible a person unconnected to the case walked through the campsite in the window between the family leaving and our arrival. None of those explanations fit the evidence cleanly, and none of them were disproven. Ethan Maddox is the reason his family is alive. When the second man stepped onto the service road from the tree line and grabbed his father, Ethan didn't hesitate. He pulled Cass off the road and down into the drainage ditch below the embankment, and they went. North, downhill, through underbrush that tore at their arms. He'd studied the trail map in the tent the night before, the one the visitor center volunteer had marked in pencil, and he remembered that the creek east of Site 14 ran roughly parallel to the spur road before crossing under the paved Park Road several miles north. He didn't try to make it back to the campsite. He didn't try the spur road. He followed the creek downstream because he knew where the creek would eventually go. Cass kept up. When the brush got too thick, she went through it. When Ethan lost his footing on wet rock, she braced him. Neither of them called out. They moved for over 3 hours through terrain that would have discouraged most adults, and reached the paved road within sight of Sandra Hoff's maintenance truck. Site 14 is still active. We removed the closed service road from all published maps and gated it permanently. The Site 14 spur was cleared and its culverts reinforced. But the counterfeit trail signs are what stay with me. The care in them, the routed lettering, the mounting hardware, the folded topographic map with 5 carefully chosen sites circled in pencil. Somewhere in that pattern was preparation that predated the Maddox family by months, and the number of primitive drive-in sites like Site 14 at parks I've never worked is larger than I like to think about. Story 2. The search volunteer who wasn't registered. The briefing for the Marcus Ware search started at 6:15 in the Elk Basin parking lot. I was 3 weeks into my first season as a seasonal ranger in a recreation area along the central Colorado Rockies. My only prior search had been a day hiker with a twisted ankle, located and walked out inside 2 hours. This was different. Marcus Ware, 31, experienced solo hiker, 48 hours overdue. His gray Subaru Outback sat unattended at the Ridgeline trailhead. His itinerary listed a 2-night loop through the upper basin with a planned exit Monday afternoon. It was now Wednesday. Roughly 40 people had gathered by the time the incident commander, a senior ranger named Garza, started assigning sectors. The gathering itself was the first thing that told me why an unfamiliar face could disappear in plain sight. There were paid staff from 3 neighboring jurisdictions, There were volunteers from the county SAR chapter and 2 chapters from farther south. There were dog handlers with vehicles I didn't recognize. There were people who nodded at each other with the familiarity of a dozen prior operations, and people, like me, who nodded at everyone because we didn't know who we were supposed to know. Garza worked from a laminated grid map at the tailgate of a truck. He divided the basin's north slope into sectors, called out pairings, and moved through logistics without wasted words. I drew Sector 7 with another seasonal named Tom Atchison. 3 miles of unmaintained trail, 2 creek crossings, the second one at higher elevation where snowmelt was still running hard. I noticed the man for the first time as the briefing broke up. He was standing near the map board when I came back from my pack. Mid-40s, weathered face, closely trimmed beard. Dark green soft-shell jacket without any visible logo or patch. Cargo hiking pants, a chest-mounted radio in a black nylon harness, the antenna angled up over his shoulder. GPS unit on his belt, multi-tool pouch beside it. He looked like every experienced volunteer I'd been introduced to that morning. "You two have Sector 7? He addressed me the way an older employee addresses a new hire. Easy, informative, not asking permission. "Watch the upper crossing. Snowmelt's running fast up there. If Marcus tried to ford in the dark, that's your high probability area. And there's a game trail on the far bank that comes in at a similar grade to the maintained path. People get turned around by it." It was useful. It was specific. It was the kind of detail you'd only know from having walked that section. And I remembered it clearly later, not because it was suspicious at the time, but because it was the first thing that made him seem like someone whose judgment I could trust. Tom came over, and the man repeated the tip. Then he shifted his pack and drifted back toward the map board, and we headed out. Sector 7 took most of the morning. We called Marcus's name at intervals, checked drainages and blowdowns, worked both creek crossings methodically. At the upper crossing, we spent 40 minutes searching for any evidence of a fall or a failed ford. Torn fabric, drag marks, disturbed gravel. Nothing. Around 11, on the descent back toward the junction, we met 2 volunteers from Sector 6. A married couple named Dale and Yvette from the local SAR chapter. Dale was the one who first mentioned him. "A guy in a green jacket came through our sector about an hour ago, said he was checking a sighting reported on a different frequency, moving pretty fast uphill." "Beard? Chest radio?" I asked. "That's him," said he was one of the team leaders. Tom keyed our radio. "Garza, has any team leader been reassigned to check a sighting in Sector 6? The pause was short. "Negative. No sightings reported. All team leaders are in their assigned sectors. Confirm the source of that information." Tom described the man. "Garza asked us to hold and confirm before proceeding." We stood at the junction and waited, and after maybe 15 minutes, the man came down the slope toward us from the direction of the ridge saddle. He greeted us again as if the earlier conversation had never ended, sat on a flat rock near the trail, unzipped a side pocket, produced an energy bar, asked what we'd found at the upper crossing, asked whether the water had shown any sign of recent disturbance. Then he said, "Marcus probably didn't push past the basin rim. He's got a bad knee. Old ACL repair. He wouldn't have committed to that kind of ascent on snowpack." I stopped what I was doing. "Where'd you hear about his knee?" "Briefing packet?" The briefing packet did not include Marcus's medical history. I had read it twice. Physical description, vehicle, route plan, emergency contacts, gear list. No injuries, no prior surgeries. He held my gaze for a beat too long, then let it go. I'm probably thinking of a different search. You do enough of these, they blur. He finished the energy bar, folded the wrapper, and put it in his pocket. Then he stood and pointed toward the ridge behind him. I'm going to check the old fire lookout foundation up on the saddle. Stone walls, partial shelter. People hole up in it when weather turns. Actually, and he glanced at me, Garza just reassigned Tom to a team over in Sector 5. They need another set of eyes on a possible clothing find. So it's you and me on the saddle. The foundation's tucked in a blind drainage, and it's easy to walk past if you don't know the approach. I looked at Tom. Tom's radio hadn't received any such reassignment. Neither had mine. When did that come through? I asked. Just now, on the channel I've been monitoring. He tapped the radio on his chest. The green LED was lit. I'd watched him for close to a minute at that point, and had never seen him press the transmit button. Never heard his voice through any speaker on any channel. Let's confirm it with Garza directly, I said. Sure, but you and I should start up. Tom can catch up if the reassignment falls through. We'll wait. His expression didn't change, but his posture recalibrated. A subtle shift of weight, the small adjustment a person makes when a plan needs to be revised in real time. Tom keyed the radio. Garza, confirm reassignment for Atchison to Sector 5. Garza's response was flat and immediate. Negative. No reassignments have been issued. Who is requesting? Tom looked at the man. The man looked at his own radio, frowned as if reading a display none of us could see, and said, Must have crossed channels. My mistake. I'll head up alone. He shouldered his pack and started up the slope toward the saddle without waiting for us to respond. Not fast, not slow, just steadily moving away. Tom keyed the radio again. Garza, we have an unregistered individual in Sector 7. Mid-40s, green soft shell, beard, chest-mounted radio. He just attempted to reassign my partner and separate our team, requesting law enforcement contact. Do not approach. Do not follow. Hold position. Driscoll is en route. The man was already 3 switchbacks up the slope by the time we agreed not to follow him. Ranger Driscoll, Law Enforcement Division, reached us in about 40 minutes. He was in his 50s, precise, and asked questions in the order he needed them answered. He walked me through every interaction from the parking lot forward. Then he asked something I hadn't thought about explicitly. His radio, did it ever transmit? Did you ever hear his voice through a speaker on any channel? Did you ever see him key the mic? I replayed everything. The radio had been visible on his chest since the briefing. The green light had been on. But I'd never seen him press the transmit button. Never heard him speak into it. Never heard his voice come through on any frequency Tom or I had been monitoring. Receive only unit, Driscoll said, half to himself. While we were still talking, one of the dog handlers back at the trailhead noticed something the initial response team had missed. Boot prints around Marcus Ware's Subaru. Someone had walked a slow circle around the vehicle, pausing at each window, spending extra time at the rear hatch. Lug sole, size 11 or 12. Underneath the prints left by the first responding rangers, meaning they'd been made before the search had even been assembled. Marcus Ware was found alive the next morning. He'd taken a fall on a loose scree field about 6 miles from the trailhead on the second morning of his trip. He'd fractured his fibula and slid maybe 40 feet before catching against a boulder. He'd crawled to a sheltered overhang, rationed his water in small, measured sips, used the mirror on the back of his compass to signal at intervals during the daylight hours. His GPS watch had logged his position and heart rate continuously, and when rescuers reached him, he was able to walk them through his entire route since the trailhead. He had done everything a resourceful, prepared hiker could do to keep himself alive. The helicopter picked up his mirror flash on the second pass. During his evacuation interview, Marcus described something that hadn't been in any briefing. On his second evening, camped near the basin rim, a man had walked into his sight around dusk, said he was a backcountry ranger doing a routine permit check, friendly, asked about his route, his planned exit time, where he'd parked, and whether anyone was expecting him at a specific hour on a specific day. Marcus answered honestly. The man noticed the knee brace and asked if the injury was recent. Marcus told him it was an old ACL repair. The man wished him a good night and walked off toward the north slope in the dark. Marcus fell the next morning on a section of scree he would have crossed regardless. But when Driscoll showed him a photograph pulled from the recreation area's earlier files, a still image from a trailhead surveillance camera taken during an unrelated incident 3 months earlier, Marcus identified him within seconds. Same man, same green jacket, same trimmed beard. Driscoll's subsequent review found that the man's boot prints matched tracks recovered at 2 other trailheads in the recreation area, both during active search operations earlier that season. In both cases, vehicles belonging to overdue hikers had been broken into and their contents partially removed. Cash, electronics, registration information, wallets left in glove compartments. The break-ins had occurred during the middle of the search day, when the entire response apparatus was deployed miles into the backcountry, and the trailhead lots were completely unmonitored. The pattern was straightforward once Driscoll laid it out. A commercial scanner picks up SAR channel traffic. The missing person's name, vehicle description, plate number, and itinerary are typically broadcast within the first hour of an operation. Someone attending the search as a helpful volunteer can move freely, learn which lots will be empty for how long, and time a return trip to a specific vehicle. The helpful behavior, the terrain warnings, the offered information, buys credibility with new volunteers who don't know the local SAR community. The attempts to isolate partnered searchers are opportunistic, not intended to harm, but to extract additional information about search timelines and shift changes. Marcus's Subaru had been circled, but not entered. His lock showed faint tool scratches near the keyhole that he confirmed were not pre-existing. He'd interrupted his own break-in by being found alive. If he'd been unfindable for another day or two, the vehicle would have been targeted along with the others. Driscoll and a second ranger walked up to the old fire lookout foundation on the ridge saddle later that afternoon. Inside the stone walls, they found a rolled sleeping bag, food wrappers weighted with a rock, and a pair of binoculars set on a flat course of stones oriented southwest. The binoculars had a clear, unobstructed line of sight down to the ridgeline trailhead parking area. From that position, on a clear afternoon, you could count the vehicles in the lot. You could see when rangers came and went. You could time the exact windows during which no one would notice a person walking through the rows with a slim Jim and a duffel bag. The search operation itself had been the opportunity. Every one of us who committed to a sector that morning had, without knowing it, been part of the plan. The vehicle I saw pulling out of the overflow lot later that afternoon, an older, dark pickup with no front plate, was never conclusively identified. I wrote down what I could read of the plate before it turned onto the county road. One digit was off, or one was missing. Driscoll thanked me for the effort and told me honestly that partial plates rarely produce results. I still work seasonal shifts in that recreation area. I've been on 4 searches since, Every one of them begins with a briefing that includes an updated volunteer credentialing procedure and a physical sign-in sheet at the command post that didn't exist the year Marcus went missing. Small changes, not dramatic ones, but the kind of changes that close a specific door. Story 3. The trail markers pointed the wrong way. The sign at the junction said Bower Creek Trail, 3.2 miles, with an arrow pointing left. Our offline map said Bower Creek was to the right. Dana held her phone next to the post and compared. The topographic lines were unambiguous. The maintained trail followed a ridge contour to the right and descended to a creek crossing whose position matched Bower Creek exactly on the USGS layer. The left fork dropped steeply into a hollow with no named water feature within a mile. "The sign's wrong," she said. The sign didn't look wrong. It looked entirely correct. A standard brown composite post with a routed placard, clean white lettering, the mounting style used on every trail in that stretch of the southern Appalachians. The arrow pointed left with an arrowhead that matched the arrowhead on our permit. We stood there for a minute, both of us cycling through the ordinary explanations. Maybe the map was outdated. Maybe the trail had been rerouted and the digital map hadn't been refreshed. Maybe the sign referred to a different Bower Creek, a tributary, or a fork we weren't reading correctly. Maybe someone had installed the sign incorrectly during a maintenance rotation and no one had caught it yet. We went right. This was our first overnight backpacking trip since our daughter was born 14 months earlier. She was with Dana's parents. We'd driven 3 hours to a section of Appalachian highlands where national forest land bordered a patchwork of private timber holdings, less traffic than the popular corridors farther south, which was why we'd chosen it. 2 nights, 22 miles, 4 established campsites. Dana had downloaded the offline topographic map the night before because cell service in the area was effectively zero. The trail matched the map within minutes: ridge contour, gradual descent, a log bridge across a creek whose position, orientation, and flow direction all matched the USGS data for Bower Creek. We reached the first campsite by early afternoon and set up feeling better than we had since bringing our daughter home from the hospital. The second sign appeared a quarter mile past camp, at a fork that didn't exist on our map. It read, Bower Creek Loop, return route, and pointed down a narrow path angling sharply away from the main trail. The map showed no fork here. The trail continued straight, but the sign was there, mounted on a composite post, the lettering clean and the arrow crisp. We kept straight. I took a photo of the sign because the mismatch was strange enough to want to report at the ranger station on the way out. That evening, another hiker came into our campsite. Solo, late 20s, heavy pack, tired. His name was Kevin. He was hiking the same loop in the opposite direction and had almost gone off trail twice. The signs aren't matching the map, he said, dropping his pack by the fire ring. I mean, they're not just turned around. They're different signs entirely. New posts, new placards. I have a paper map, and none of what I'm seeing matches it. Dana pulled up her offline topo. Kevin pointed to a junction ahead on our route, about 4 miles from where we were camped. That one sent me a quarter mile downhill into a ravine. The grade felt wrong from the start, but the sign was so confident. When I finally stopped and looked at my paper map, I was way off the loop. I had to bushwhack back up to the ridge. He described what he'd noticed at the false signpost. The bolts were bright, unoxidized steel. The post had 2 sets of drilled holes, the original mounting holes, which were empty. and a second set that held the counterfeit placard. Fresh wood shavings on the ground beneath the post. Someone had drilled new holes with a portable tool and mounted a replacement placard, probably within the last few days. Then he said something that stayed with me. On my way back up out of the ravine, I ran into a guy coming down. Older, in decent hiking gear, no pack, real calm. He told me the route had been recently changed, and that the ravine trail was the new route. Said the Forest Service had updated the loop last month. I told him my paper map didn't show that, and he shrugged and said the map was probably a year or two out of date. He was so relaxed about it, not pushy, just informative. If I hadn't already looked at the terrain and known the grade was wrong, I probably would have turned around and followed him. Kevin hadn't. He'd continued up out of the ravine and back to the ridge and followed his paper map from that point forward. Dana asked if he'd seen the man again. Kevin said no. He left our campsite early the next morning. We broke camp an hour later and continued the loop, watching the trail more carefully than we had the day before. The third sign was the one that clarified everything. It appeared at a junction that existed on our map. The correct trail went left toward Ridge Camp, where we planned to spend our final night. The counterfeit sign directed hikers right down a well-worn path through dense hardwood forest toward the private land boundary. This one was the most convincing yet. Trail name, mileage estimate, a pictograph indicating a water source, the same iconography the Forest Service uses on real signs. It also included a bridge closure notice. Main trail closed. Bridge out. Use alternate route. There was no bridge on the main trail in this section. Our map confirmed the next mile and a half was dry ridge walking with no water crossings and nothing to bridge. Dana stepped off the trail into the undergrowth on the left side. She came back a moment later. The real sign is over here. I followed her. 30 feet into the brush, lying face down in a patch of ferns, was a routed composite sign, identical in construction to every legitimate marker we'd passed. Someone had unbolted it from its post and set it aside neatly. The two mounting bolts were placed in a row on top of the sign, aligned parallel, as if someone had intended to reinstall it later. The wood beneath the sign was dry. It had been removed recently. Dana knelt beside the empty post. Fresh gouges in the composite around the bolt holes, tool marks from a wrench or socket that had slipped. On the ground, caught in a tuft of grass, a thin curl of green-painted wood. The counterfeit signs were painted wood, not routed composite. Up close, the difference was obvious. At walking distance on a maintained trail, you'd never notice. Dana photographed the counterfeit sign, the empty post, the removed original, the curled wood shaving, and the surrounding terrain. She noted the coordinates from the offline map. We didn't touch the removed sign beyond confirming what it was. We reinstalled nothing. We continued left toward Ridge Camp using our own map. We reached Ridge Camp in late afternoon and set up quietly. Both of us cooked dinner without saying much. Both of us were working the same question. Where was the false route going, and why? Around 8:30, full dark, footsteps on the trail behind our campsite. Steady, bipedal, no light of any kind, maybe 80 feet from the tent. The footsteps stopped. Dana was inside the tent, sitting up, facing the sound. I was outside near the fire ring. Neither of us moved. Neither of us said anything. The silence held for maybe 3 minutes. Then softly, I heard a voice. Low, male. 1 or 2 words spoken quietly, not to us. The the kind of tone a person uses on a handheld radio when they don't want the sound to carry. A brief burst of static followed, then nothing. Not wildlife, not an animal, a person standing in the dark on the trail behind our campsite, communicating with someone else. I stepped slowly into the tent and zipped it behind me. We turned off our headlamps. We waited. Maybe 5 minutes later, the sound of footsteps resumed and moved back the way they'd come. No light, no hurry. We didn't sleep well. At first light, I stepped out and walked the trail to where the footsteps had stopped. Fresh boot prints in the mud, deep. The weight shifted repeatedly, as if the person had stood in one place for several minutes. I followed the prints about 100 yards in the direction they'd come from. The trail curved past a stand of mountain laurel, and just past the curve, off the trail to the left, in a small clearing screened by brush, I saw the corner of a vehicle. Dark-colored SUV, or truck, backed into a gap where an old logging skid road met the trail. No plates visible from my angle. A short antenna was mounted on the cab roof, the kind used with handheld GMRS or CB radios. I did not approach it. I backed up slowly, watching where I put my feet, and returned to camp. Dana already had the map out. We didn't have to discuss it. Ridge Camp sat on the ridge, and the map showed a second maintained trail that dropped east off the ridge toward a Forest Service road that intersected the loop about 5 miles from our vehicle, longer than our original route out, but it did not pass any of the false sign junctions we'd already identified, and it moved us away from the direction the vehicle had been facing. We packed in under 10 minutes. We took the eastern trail. We used the map and compass exclusively and ignored every sign we passed for the rest of the hike. We reached the Forest Service road by mid-morning and walked another 2 miles back to our vehicle. We reported everything to the Forest Service district office that afternoon. The investigation that followed took several months, and I only learned pieces of the outcome. What I can tell you is that the counterfeit signs serve 2 purposes that fit together cleanly. First, they diverted ordinary hikers away from a drainage on the private land side of the boundary, where an illegal operation was running. The district office described it generally as involving poaching activity and equipment stolen from other properties in the region. Second, any hiker who did wander close was routed toward a controlled old access route, where lookouts positioned along the ridge could observe them from concealed positions, and if necessary, redirect them with plausible closure stories about washed-out trails or bridge repairs. The signs did not lead hikers into the center of the operation. They led hikers into a funnel where the operation could evaluate whether the hiker was a threat and gently steer them elsewhere. The vehicle I'd seen matched the description of one identified during the investigation. The radio was consistent with the frequencies the lookouts used. Dana and I still backpack. We do not use the section of trail we hiked that weekend. We haven't been back. What I keep coming back to isn't the vehicle or the operation or the man Kevin met on the ravine trail. It's the removed sign in the ferns with its bolts arranged in a neat row on top of it, waiting to be reinstalled once we'd passed. The counterfeit signs we saw were built with fresh wood, clean paint, and bright new mounting hardware. The paths those signs pointed toward were beaten smooth by feet that had followed them long before ours. Story 4. The Ranger at the Closed Entrance. He was standing in the middle of the road holding a flashlight at waist height, the beam sweeping slowly across our windshield, the way a traffic officer directs vehicles at a construction zone. Not waving, not urgent, controlled. My daughter Rachel saw him first. "Dad, is that a ranger?" We were 12 miles into a national monument in southeastern Utah, high desert, sandstone canyon country, the kind of landscape that feels enormous and deeply empty after dark. We'd entered through the main gate a little after 4 that afternoon, spent hours at an overlook in a short interpretive trail, and were driving out on the single paved road that connects the monument's interior to the highway. It was 8:45, full dark, no moon. That afternoon at the visitor center, we'd spent close to 15 minutes with a ranger named Gutierrez. She was maybe 30, professional, and Rachel had asked her a run of questions about desert ecology and the monument's off-season staffing. Gutierrez had answered all of it patiently. Rachel is 24, a graduate student in environmental science, and she'd interned at a national monument in Arizona the previous summer. She noticed the details of Gutierrez's uniform without commenting on them: the arrowhead patch on the sleeve, the brass name tag on the right chest, the shoulder radio on a proper carrier, the marked patrol vehicle parked outside with the agency shield on the door. Gutierrez had mentioned that the visitor center closed at sunset, and no staff remained inside the monument overnight during the off-season. The entrance road stayed open for visitors driving out, but anyone still inside after dark should expect no staffed checkpoint or a routine patrol presence until morning. She'd said it as ordinary information, the kind of thing a visiting ranger's daughter would file away and forget. The man in the road stepped to the driver's side as I slowed the 4Runner. Flat-brimmed hat, dark button-down shirt with a patch on the chest, green utility pants, belt with a radio carrier, and a pouch. He looked the part. "Evening, folks. Roads closed ahead. Rockfall situation about 2 miles down, near the switchback below the overlook. Maintenance crew's been called out, but they're not going to have it cleared tonight." "We just need to get back to the highway," I said. "Yes, sir. We're routing traffic through the North Maintenance Road. It connects back to the highway about 6 miles east of the main entrance. If you turn around, you'll take the first left past the Juniper Flat pullout." Rachel was quiet in the passenger seat. I could feel her attention shift. "Is there a barricade up ahead?" I asked. "We're getting cones set up now, just a soft closure until the crew arrives." I looked past him. Our headlights reached maybe 200 feet down the road. No cones, no flashing lights, no vehicles, nothing but empty blacktop and the silhouettes of the canyon walls on either side. "Can you radio dispatch and confirm the closure? I want to know when the crew's expected." He tapped the carrier on his belt. "Radio's been spotty. Canyon interference, but it's confirmed. Started about 30 minutes ago." Beside me, without turning her head, Rachel reached down and pressed the lock button on her door. The soft click was almost inaudible over the engine. She leaned forward a few inches, as if to look past me at the man, and asked, "What's your name?" He paused. "Not long. Half a second. Hendricks, overnight crew." The visitor center that afternoon had been clear that there was no overnight crew. My hand was on the gear shift. The 4Runner was in first gear, engine running, foot on the clutch and brake. I could feel Rachel's eyes moving across the man's chest, cataloging what she was seeing. Later she'd tell me, the patch was rectangular and dark, but it didn't carry the arrowhead. Not NPS, not BLM, generic. No name tag on the right chest where Gutierrez's had been, and the radio carrier on his belt was empty. It was just the black nylon holster. There was no radio inside it. The tap he'd made was on plastic and fabric. "Sir?" Rachel touched my forearm. Just her fingertips. 2 light taps, then a slight squeeze. She kept her eyes forward through the windshield. I looked in the rearview mirror. Behind us, at the edge of what the taillights barely illuminated, maybe 200 yards back, at the point where the maintenance road forked off the main route, There was a figure standing on the road's shoulder, not moving, just standing. "We appreciate the warning," I said to the man at my window. "Let me just pull forward a bit and turn around up there. The shoulder's too soft to swing it." "You can turn around right here, sir." "I'd rather use the pull-out ahead, easier on the transmission." He hesitated. Then he stepped back from the door, waved me forward with a small motion of the flashlight. I let the clutch out slowly. The 4Runner rolled forward about 10 feet. In the mirror, I watched him take another step back, keeping level with my rear bumper. I put my left hand on the shifter and glanced at Rachel. "Hold on." I depressed the clutch, shifted into reverse, and let it out fast. The truck lurched backward maybe 15 feet, and the man had to move quickly to the shoulder to keep clear. The flashlight beam swung wide. For a moment, he was well behind the vehicle, well away from my window, standing off to the side of the road with the beam pointed at the ground. I shifted into second, released the clutch, and drove forward. I chose the rockfall. Past him, past the point where his silhouette shrank in the mirrors, past the point where I could hear his voice sharpen into something that was no longer patient. Sir, the road is closed." I kept driving. In the mirror, I could see him standing in the road, flashlight tracked toward our rear window. And beyond him, the second figure had stepped off the shoulder and was walking toward the maintenance road entrance, not running, not chasing, but repositioning, as if the plan had assumed a certain outcome and now needed adjustment. I accelerated, the road curved through the canyon, and for the next 2 miles I drove faster than the terrain allowed. Rachel had her phone out, no signal. She held it up anyway, tilted toward the windshield, watching the reception icon. There was no rockfall, no cones, no debris, no maintenance crew. The pavement was clear the entire way. The switchback below the overlook, where the man had specifically said the fall had occurred, was empty and undamaged. "Dad, behind us." I checked the mirror. Far back, in the dark, amber pinpoints. A vehicle running with only its parking lights on, following through the curves at a distance that neither closed nor fell back. I held my speed. We rounded a long right-hand bend, then a shorter left, and I recognized a rock formation from our drive in, a fin of pale sandstone that meant we were within a couple of miles of the main gate. Rachel recognized it too. She'd taken photos on the way in. The parking light vehicle kept its distance for another mile. Then, as the road began to widen and the main gate came into view ahead, the amber lights slowed. They stopped. They went dark. In the mirror, I watched a vehicle begin a 3-point turn in the middle of the road and reverse back into the canyon. We reached the highway. I pulled onto the wide shoulder past the entrance, put the truck in park, and turned off the engine. My hands were unsteady on the wheel. Rachel already had 1 bar of signal and was dialing. The county deputy who met us drove into the monument with his lights on. He came back out 40 minutes later and told us there was no one on the road, no vehicle on the maintenance track, no evidence of any rockfall, and no closure of any kind. He took our descriptions carefully. He asked good questions: what direction the man had been facing when we first saw him, whether we could describe the second figure's build or clothing, whether the pursuing vehicle had a distinctive engine sound. He did not offer explanations. He did not tell us we'd been lucky. He did tell us that the maintenance road we'd been directed toward runs about 4 miles from the main route to a dead end at a dry wash surrounded by 100-foot sandstone walls, with no cell coverage the entire way. I called the monument's visitor center in the morning. Gutierrez answered. There was no Hendricks on staff. There had been no overnight crew, no closure, no reported rockfall. She took our full account and asked us to stay on the line while she looped in a law enforcement ranger who took the report over the phone. The follow-up produced very little. A partial tire impression was recovered near the maintenance road entrance. It matched nothing conclusive. No suspects were identified. No vehicle was located. The visitor center added a small note to their afternoon checkout procedure that season, informally reminding visitors to verify any after-hours road closure through the main gate before complying. I don't know what those two men planned to do if we'd turned onto the maintenance road. I can only tell you what I know for certain. The detour would have taken us 4 miles into an unlit canyon with no cell signal, to a dead end, with one stranger behind us on the main road and another waiting at the turnoff. Rachel is the reason we didn't take it. She caught the details I would have missed. The wrong patch, the missing name tag, the empty carrier where a radio should have been. She'd spent a summer working alongside real rangers, learning what the uniform is supposed to look like from the collar down. The man in the road looked almost right. Almost was the distance that mattered. Story 5. The ranger station that was already occupied. The chimney was producing smoke. I saw it from a 1/4 mile out, through a gap in the birch and spruce where the access road crested a low rise. A thin gray thread climbing from the stone chimney of the Tamarack Lake Ranger Station, barely visible against the October overcast. I stopped the truck and sat with the engine running. The station was supposed to be vacant. It had been vacant since late August, when the last seasonal ranger, a college kid named Peters, closed it up, drained the pipes, shut off the propane, locked the doors, and drove out for the season. I'd seen his closure checklist. I was the one who filed it. I worked maintenance for a land management agency in northern Minnesota. That October, I'd been assigned pre-winter inspections on 3 remote structures. Check roofs, clear gutters, verify window seals, confirm the buildings were secure for 6 months of freeze. Tamarack Lake was the most remote of the 3, 14 miles from the paved road, the last 7 on a gravel track that turned to soft mud in the rain. I sat on the rise for a full minute watching the smoke. Then I picked up the handset and radioed a routine arrival to the maintenance channel. Dispatch, this is Unit 4, arriving at Tamarack Lake for pre-winter inspection. Estimate on scene in 5 minutes, dispatch acknowledged. I put the handset back in the cradle. I drove forward slowly, checking the road as I went. No fresh tire tracks in the mud except mine. The gravel pad in front of the station was empty. No vehicle, the front door was closed, the windows intact, the porch undisturbed. The chimney kept smoking. I parked, got out, and walked to the front door. The standard agency deadbolt was engaged, properly locked from the outside. I used my key. The room was warm, not residual sun warm, maintained warm. The wood stove was radiating heat, and the side was too hot to hold my hand against. The damper was set to a low, efficient burn. Whoever had loaded it understood a wood stove. I stood in the doorway with the key still in my hand and looked at the room. Peters had left it clean. Desk against the wall, cot in the corner with the mattress bare, kitchenette along the back wall, small bathroom, storage closet. That's what should have been in front of me. Instead, small details started reorganizing my understanding of the space one at a time. The cupboard above the kitchenette was closed, but when I opened it, I found food that hadn't been there in August. Canned soup, crackers, peanut butter, instant oatmeal, ground coffee. None of it was park inventory. The agency doesn't provision remote stations. Rangers bring their own supplies and pack out what they don't use. Peters had left a first aid kit, water purification tablets, and a station logbook. The logbook was still there, pushed to the back of the cupboard. The food was arranged in front of it, the cot. Peters had stripped it, bedding removed and packed out, mattress bare. A sleeping bag was now laid out flat on the mattress, unzipped, functioning as a blanket. It had been smoothed and squared. The pillow end was tucked. Someone had slept there recently and made the bed carefully before leaving. I stepped into the bathroom. The pipes were live. Peters had drained the system in August. Someone had reopened the shutoff valve behind the sink. The faucet ran clear water. A damp towel was folded neatly on the sink's edge. A toothbrush stood in a ceramic mug on the shelf, and the bristles were still wet enough to catch the light. I walked back into the main room and opened the desk drawer. Peters's station log was in the drawer. So were the trail map and the maintenance checklist he'd left behind. Sitting on top of them, though, was a spiral notebook that had never been park property. Blue cover, college ruled, about half full. I opened it. The first several pages contained vehicle descriptions. Color, make, model, plate numbers. No names. Beside each entry, a date and a time. The dates began in early September, about 2 weeks after Peters had officially closed the station, and continued through the previous week. Deeper in the notebook, the entries expanded. Arrival times, departure times, number of occupants, which trailhead they'd parked at, whether they carried overnight packs, whether they had dogs, whether they appeared to be solo, family, or overnight campers. One entry read, Blue Tacoma, MN plates, 2 adults, 1 child, large pack, probably overnight, Upper Tamarack site. Another, white Jeep, WI plates, solo male, fishing gear, left at 4:15. Pages of this, dozens of vehicles, dozens of visitors, documented in steady, methodical handwriting that did not vary or hurry across 6 weeks of entries. The most recent entry was dated 2 days earlier. I set the notebook down on the desk. The stove ticked. The room was quiet enough to hear the fire settling in its own ashes. Then I noticed the scanner. On the shelf above the desk, partly hidden behind a box of 9-volt batteries, a handheld scanner sat cycling through frequencies. Not a park radio, a commercial unit, the kind sold at any consumer electronics store. Volume set low, the green display scrolling slowly through channels. I leaned in and watched the readout cycle. Park ranger frequencies, county sheriff dispatch, the regional forest service repeater, and the maintenance channel, the one I'd used 5 minutes earlier to radio my arrival. If the scanner had been on when I keyed that transmission, whoever occupied this station had heard me announce myself. I looked at the shelf beside the scanner. Photographs, printed on regular paper, slightly pixelated, inkjet output. About 15 loose prints, some curled at the edges. They showed people, hikers at trailheads, stepping out of vehicles, adjusting packs, studying maps. Taken from distance, telephoto or heavy zoom. Some from elevated positions looking down through gaps in tree cover. I recognized the Upper Tamarack trailhead in several shots. One showed 2 women unloading backpacks from a red SUV. The plate number was legible and matched an entry in the notebook exactly. I put the photographs down and thought about the schedule. 3 days earlier, my supervisor had confirmed the date and approximate arrival time of this inspection over the maintenance channel. It had been a routine exchange. Weather, road conditions, a reminder to bring the shim kit for the door frame. If anyone had been listening on this scanner, They would have known when I was coming, within an hour. They knew I was coming. They'd left before I arrived. But not long before. The stove was still radiating. The toothbrush was still wet. The landline telephone was mounted on the wall beside the bathroom door. An old rotary model installed decades ago when the station first went in. Public telephone service to the station had been disconnected in August as part of the seasonal closure. I picked up the receiver, expecting silence. Dial tone. Not the low hum of a residual open line. A working dial tone. I stood with the receiver against my ear, listening to a sound that was not supposed to exist. Remote stations like this one still had legacy copper wiring from an older internal maintenance line network. Junction boxes scattered through the woods that had once connected staff quarters and lookouts before commercial service reached the area. If someone had physical access to one of those junction boxes and basic electrical knowledge, they could bridge the station's phone to a working local line without going through the phone company at all. Someone had done that. I started to dial my supervisor's direct number. 4 digits in, the phone rang. Incoming. The old mechanical bell, loud in the small room. I held the receiver against my ear and felt it vibrate. 4 rings. Then silence. The caller had to be local. The temporary bridge would only connect to lines physically wired into the same legacy network. Whoever rang that phone was somewhere within the network's reach, not miles away, not out on the highway. Close. They were checking to see if I was inside. I hung up. I stood still for a moment, then stepped to the front window and looked out at the gravel pad. My truck sat where I'd left it. The tree line stood undisturbed on 3 sides. Nothing moved. Then I looked at the ground beside the driver's door. A boot print in the soft mud. Fresh, clear tread pattern, water beginning to seep into the depression. It had not been there when I walked in. I had stepped directly from the truck to the porch, and the mud beside the driver's side had been smooth. Someone had approached my vehicle while I was inside the station. I picked up the notebook, the photographs, and the scanner. I put them under one arm. As I did, the scanner in my hand crackled softly, a brief transmission on the maintenance channel. Not a voice, just a key up, a 2-second pause, and a release. The kind of thing that happens when someone presses the transmit button to test the connection or to signal a listener on the same frequency that they're monitoring. I walked to the front door. I stepped onto the porch. I did not look at the tree line for more than a second. I walked to the truck, got in, locked the doors, started the engine, and drove. 14 miles to pavement. 7 of them on gravel and mud, with the trees pressing in on both sides. The mirrors showed empty road the entire way. I drove too fast. The truck fishtailed twice on wet corners. I did not slow down. When I reached cell coverage, I called my supervisor directly. Law enforcement rangers went to the station the following morning with a county deputy. The station was clean, not the way Peters had left it. Clean the way someone cleans a space they're abandoning. The cupboard was empty. The cot was stripped. The towel and the toothbrush were gone. The stove was cold and the ashes had been raked out. The landline was dead. At a junction box about 200 yards into the trees along the old maintenance line route, investigators found fresh tool marks on the housing and compression fittings that didn't match agency equipment. Someone had made a temporary physical bridge and removed it after I'd left. The notebook, photographs, and scanner I'd taken were real evidence. When investigators cross-referenced the notebook's vehicle entries against permit records, every entry matched. Every plate, every date, every trailhead. 4 of the vehicles in the notebook belonged to visitors who had filed complaints during the previous weeks, feeling watched on the trail, finding their campsites disturbed after day hikes, encountering a man in the backcountry who asked detailed questions about their plans and their vehicles, and whether anyone expected them at a specific time. 2 others had cut their trips short, citing discomfort they couldn't put into words. A records review turned up part of the entry method. A seasonal contractor who'd worked a road repair project in the park 2 years earlier had been issued a maintenance master key. He'd left the project before it was completed. The key was never returned, and no one had ever changed the locks on the affected structures. No one was found in the woods. No arrest was made. The station's exterior door was re-inspected shortly after the incident. New locks were ordered, but because the installation had to be coordinated with a crew capable of reaching the remote site, the original lock remained in place for a documented window of several days in late October and early November. The former contractor's missing master key would still have worked during that period. The replacement locks were finally installed in November. I went back to Tamarack Lake the following May as part of the reopening crew. The station was cold and dusty. Peter's first aid kit and purification tablets were in the cupboard where he'd left them the previous August. The cot was bare. The stove was clean. But in the desk drawer, underneath the station log, I found a single sheet of paper, a vehicle description, my truck, my plate number, the date of my October inspection, and beside it, in the same careful handwriting as the notebook, one word: punctual. Those were 5 accounts from people who walked into places they had every reason to trust and discovered that someone had studied that trust carefully. A vest and a clipboard, a receive-only scanner, 7 counterfeit trail signs. A flashlight held at exactly the right angle. A locked door on a station that was never quite as empty as the paperwork said. If one of these stories stayed with you more than the others, I'd like to know which one. Leave a comment, and if you have your own experience, something that happened on a trail, at a campsite, at a trailhead, or in a place that was supposed to be safe, consider sharing it. The best stories on this channel have always come from the people watching. If you're new to Mind After Dark, subscribe. There are more accounts like these, and they'll be here when you're ready for them. I'll see you in the next one.